out for our program this evening. If you're a frequent library visitor, I'd like to welcome you back. And if you have not visited our library before, please take a few moments after the program to take a look at all the resources that we have to offer here. With the library card, you can have free access to everything from books, to classes, to online resources, and a lot of great things here for you. So please take some time after the event to take a look at our library. A few items of housekeeping before we start. After the presentation, there's going to be a question and answer period, and there's going to be two of us with a microphone. So if you have a question, if you could raise your hand, and then one of us will come to you with a microphone so everybody can hear your question. Also, after the program, we're going to have some complimentary refreshments, and you can take some time to visit our exhibit and to also meet our speaker and guest of honor. So before we move into more information about tonight's program, I would like to introduce the president of the Library Foundation, Maura Kelly. Our foundation exists solely to aid the library with our programs and resources, and we are very fortunate to have a wonderful group of volunteers. So, Maura?
How to figure out how to turn on the microphone. Welcome tonight. My name is Maura Kelly. I'm president of the Peters Township Library Foundation. We're a newly formed organization. We're a little more than 2 years old. We merged the Friends group that was a volunteer organization, into the foundation. And a lot of people don't really know what we do, but we're here to support the library, as Sue said, financially and with volunteers. So anything that falls outside the normal scope of library business, or even inside the scope of library business, we try to support that. When you write a check to the library as a donation, it flows through the foundation, and we, along with Myra Lennox, the director, make decisions about how that could best be put to our overall mission here at the library. So I wanted to point out a few things to you. On your chairs, there's this, I need my glasses though. Read local, eat local. On Saturday, June 23rd, we're going to have food trucks here and 22 local authors. We do have a display set up, I think it's right back here, with a sampling of some of the works of the authors who will be there for Read Local, Eat Local. So please join us on that Saturday. Also, I wanted to point out to you, this is a story of the Whiskey Rebellion. So maybe a continuation of some of the things Denver is going to share with you tonight about Alexander Hamilton. Todd DiPastino, a local historian, is going to be coming and talking a little more, but more specifically about the Whiskey Rebellion. I've gotten to hear him talk about that before, and the good news is we were the renegades here. We tarred and feathered people, which is kind of, I don't know, I kind of like that. And then finally, I wanted to tell you that the foundation is going to be bringing author Tim O'Brien on Wednesday, November 7th. Tickets went on sale this week for that. They are $20 for adults, $15 for veterans, and $5 for students. If you're not familiar with Tim O'Brien yet, this is his best known work. He's written 9 books all about Vietnam. 8 of them are fiction, only 1 is nonfiction. And he is very well known. This particular book was nominated for the Pulitzer in the year it was written. And he is actually, this is part of our collection as well, he is one of the experts for the Ken Burns documentary about Vietnam. So we hope you will join us for that in November. And I'm going to turn you back over to Sue now so she can introduce Denver.
All right, yes, I realized I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Sue Miller, and I'm the assistant director of the library. So now we're going to move on to our event for the night. And at first, I would like to just let everybody know that we lost a good friend of our library this year, Mr. Wallace Nowinowski. And tonight's program, in partnership with the foundation, is dedicated to the memory of Mr. Nowinowski. And do we have any of the family here with us tonight, the Nowinowski family? Oh, right over here. Okay, thank you very much. We'd like to dedicate this program to Wallace. So tonight, along with the program, the Hamilton, Washington, and the creation of the United States, we're also going to open our exhibit. You can see the panels on either side. It's the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History exhibit of Alexander Hamilton, Immigrant, Patriot, and Visionary. That's going to be on display at the library till July 7th, so we hope you get a chance to look at that as well. So now I have the honor to introduce our speaker and guest of honor for tonight, who is Denver Brunsman. Denver is the Associate Professor in the History Department at George Washington University, where his courses include George Washington and His World, taught annually at Mount Vernon. He completed his MA and PhD degrees at Princeton University and his BA at St. Olaf College. His book, The Evil Necessity, British Naval Impressionment in the 18th Century Atlantic World, received the Walker Cohen Memorial Prize for an outstanding work in 18th century studies in the Americas and Atlantic world. He is also a co-author of leading college and AP US history textbook, Liberty, Equality, Power, A History of the American People, as well as the ebook, Leading Change, George Washington and Establishing the Presidency, among other works. The recipient of numerous teaching honors, he was inducted into the George Washington University Academy of Distinguished Teachers in 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Mr. Denver Brunsman.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming out tonight. Geez, it's a beautiful, beautiful night. Thursday, and you're all here to learn about history. I think that's terrific. I've been to Pittsburgh a few times, and I do the drive. It's the same drive from the Washington, D.C. area, from Alexandria, that General Braddock took, and that didn't turn out very well. So I prefer to think about the Forbes mission of 1758, which was a little bit bad. So we're all here tonight to learn about Hamilton. And the musical Hamilton has been an absolute phenomenon. It's been a gift to teachers, I think from elementary up to college. The students come into the classes, they have some idea of the founding era. Not all of it correct, but at least they have something. And it reminds me a lot of my own education. I got excited about the American Revolution and the founding era from another musical, 1776. Dating myself a bit, but we read that and actually performed it in high school, and I fell in love with the founding fathers. I was a little crushed when I found out they didn't sing their way through, you know, the writing of the Declaration of Independence, but I got over it. And when I started at George Washington University in the fall of 2012, a student of mine introduced me to Lin-Manuel Miranda, the creator of Hamilton, his song, the Hamilton Mixtape, which he had performed at the White House in 2009. And you know, that little YouTube video, I think, changed a lot of lives. I was already 3 years late to it, but I was 3 years before the musical hit Broadway. And so I shared that in my classes, and everyone who saw it was excited and impressed. And so we have, tonight I'm going to talk about the musical, I'm going to talk about the actual history, of which we have these beautiful panels. The Gilder Lehrman Institute does great work. Take some time, and you can check me, because you know, everything I say, make sure that it's correct and it's in tune with the different panels. I'm going to have a simple argument tonight, and that is that there's a lot of partnerships that were critical to the founding of the United States. But the one between George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, I think, was the most important. There's some other candidates. The partnership between Thomas Jefferson and James Madison was important. The one between Washington and Madison was important. The one between John Adams and Abigail Adams, I think, was crucial. But I don't think any of them were as significant as the one between Alexander Hamilton and George Washington. And so this is, I'm turning my little machine here. This is a little outline of what we're going to do. If you haven't seen the musical, it only has 2 acts. You get 3 acts and an epilogue tonight, so it's a real bargain. I want to start by talking about the origins of the young lives of these 2 men. Move on to the Revolutionary War, where they first met. Go on to Washington's presidency, and then talk some about the memory of them and how we remember them. In some ways, they couldn't have been more different, Washington and Hamilton. Hamilton once said of Washington, "The truth is, our own dispositions are the opposites of each other." Hamilton was impulsive, he was brilliant, but he could often be rash, get himself into a lot of trouble, as we'll see. Washington was cautious. He was deliberate. He had superb judgment. This difference might be why Ron Chernow's biography of Hamilton is a little more exciting to read than the one about Washington. Hamilton is a great biographical study because he made some very human mistakes. But in their young lives, they shared, I think, one thing, and that was they were both incredibly ambitious. They wanted to contribute to the world, and in the terms of the musical, neither one of them wanted to throw away their shot. They wanted to make the best of their opportunity. So we'll start with Hamilton. And as the first song of the musical goes, he was dropped in a forgotten spot of the Caribbean. And he really did come from the Caribbean. That's one of the true things in the musical. A fairly obscure part, the island of Nevis, which I found on my handy Google map. Someplace you couldn't drive there unless you had a boat. Nevis and St. Kitts, which at the time was in the British Leeward Islands. And Hamilton comes from such obscure beginnings that there's a debate among historians when he was born. Some historians say 1755, others say 1757. I'm going to go mostly with 1757 tonight, because that's the date that Hamilton used himself. But if you see some discrepancy in dates, that's often the reason why. He went from Nevis to spend the second part of his childhood in St. Croix, which at the time was a Danish island, and I'll talk about that. Starting in Nevis, he grew up in this house. And in the song, the very first lines of the musical, he's announced as a bastard son of a whore and a Scotsman, right? Well, some of that's true. He was a bastard son in the sense that he was born out of wedlock to his mother, Rachel, who at the time was technically married to somebody else. She had escaped that marriage, which I think all evidence suggests was an abusive marriage. She hadn't gotten divorced because she wasn't allowed to as a woman. And she met a gentleman named James Hamilton, who was a Scotsman, and he had some noble lineage, but he was a younger son. And that was a problem at the time, because in Europe, the oldest son got everything. That was a common law practice called primogeniture. So if you were a younger son, you went out in the world, and you might even end up in the Caribbean, in the Western Hemisphere. So they had 2 sons together, Alexander and James Jr. And they lived there until Alex was 8. At that age, James Hamilton took the family, actually to St. Croix. Go back to the map. He had to collect a debt there. Well, while he was there, Rachel's husband, Johann, came looking for an actual divorce. And it seemed like he wanted some money out of her. This scared away James Hamilton. He fled. And so Alexander Hamilton grew up without a father. If you know the early music, you know that both Alexander and Rachel got sick. They got yellow fever. Alex got better, but his mother went quick. That's the line goes. She died when he was 11. He moved in with a cousin who within a year or so committed suicide. So he's having a difficult childhood. The one stroke of luck he had, at that point, he was really adopted by a family in St. Croix, the Stevens family. They had a son that was just a couple of years older than Alexander, named Edward. He went by Ned. And they really took good care of him. He became apprenticed to a merchant. And by the age of 9, 10, 11, he's running the books for a major trading firm in the Atlantic world, and had a real genius with numbers that manifested. His brother James Jr. wasn't so lucky. He was apprenticed to a carpenter and never really made it. Spent most of his time actually in the Caribbean, and remained in touch with Alexander as they grew up, but really struggled the rest of his life. The major event that happened in Alexander's childhood, along with all these other major events, was a hurricane in the year 1772 that struck the Caribbean. And Hamilton wrote about it anonymously, submitted it to a newspaper, and it was all the rage. People couldn't believe how moving this account was of this hurricane. I'll give you a sense of the writing. It's pretty flowery here. He says, "The prodigious glare of almost perpetual lightning, the crash of falling houses, and the ear-splitting shrieks of the distressed." So it's very gripping. Everyone wanted to find out, who wrote this. When they found out it was Hamilton, his family, the Stevens family, along with the local clergyman, other prominent members of the community, raised funds. Historians debate whether it was Kickstarter or GoFundMe, but they got the money together to send him to the mainland. And you can see on my little Google map here, I couldn't even get to New York without losing Nevis and St. Croix. And it just shows the distance that he traveled. One reason he went to New York is that Ned was there already in college, at King's College, today called Columbia University. So this is Hamilton's origin story. I won't go into quite as much detail about George Washington because he's a little bit better known. We don't have any picture of George Washington as a youth. We'll have to settle for this great painting by Grant Wood, a good Midwestern artist from Iowa. If you know the painting American Gothic, that's Grant Wood, Pitchfork couple. You notice something in this painting, I'm guessing. There's a few interesting things going on. But the thing that really jumps out at you is that adult head on George Washington, right? And I joke with my colleagues at George Washington University in the art history department. I say, you guys can just make stuff up. When they do interpretations, you don't need to have footnotes or anything. And so I'm going to play art historian and say that I think one meaning of that is that we can't imagine George Washington as a boy. We can't imagine him as someone with insecurities and not fully grown and not, in command. But in fact, he also had some struggles in his childhood. His father, who is here right here, listening to him, his confession about the cherry tree. His father, Augustine, died when he was 11. So he also lost a parent at age 11. That closed off the best chance he would have had at a college education. His older half-brothers had gone overseas, they had gone to England. That wasn't going to happen now for George. He wasn't even going to go to the local college, William and Mary. I joke with my students, he got his degrees the best way possible, honorary degrees. That's the way to do it, if you can. But he had to grow up quick. And so, although they were a different generation, Washington was 25 years older, I think they both had that experience of having a certain insecurity, a certain ambition. The way that it's phrased in the musical is that Hamilton is young, scrappy, and hungry, just like his country. And I think there's some of that in Washington as well. There's another similarity. They both rose through military service. Hamilton wanted a war as a boy in order to prove himself. The very first letter we have from him that's kept in the Library of Congress is from 1769. He wrote to Ned, who at that point was at King's College. And Hamilton wrote, "My ambition is so prevalent that I condemn the groveling condition of a clerk. I wish there was a war." Well, there was one pretty soon after he went to North America, the American Revolutionary War. And he signed up immediately. He became a member of the New York militia. He rose to become a captain of the artillery of the New York militia. Well, Washington, of course, rose through military service as well. Some of it in his early life a little bit dubious, especially in this region. This is the very first image we have of Washington, first painting ever done. 1772, he was 40 years old, but he chose to be depicted in clothing that he wore 15 years earlier in this region when he fought in the French and Indian War. That was the most significant thing he had done in his life up to that point. So if the uniform looks a little snug, it probably was. I mean, that's like, if I went and put on my wedding tux today, it might not be quite the same. But it was had a huge influence on him. One of the first letters we have from him is from 1754. That's the year of Fort Necessity, just down the road from here, when he helped to ignite the French and Indian War. He wrote a letter to his brother, John Augustine. Now understand, things had gone very badly for him, but he was pretty good at damage control here. He wrote to his brother, he said, "I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there was something charming in the sound." And just like today with an email, you have to imagine the rest of the world is eventually going to read it. Back then, with letters, they got printed in newspapers. And this got printed and circulated all around the Atlantic so that King George II actually saw this. And his reaction was about the charming sound. He said he would not say so if he was used to hearing many. So he gets a little talk down there from the king as a young person. So you see that similar kind of naivety, ambition in both of these men. They're both born outsiders. They both lost a parent, and they both have incredible ambition. And they're, as I said, they didn't want to throw away their shot. I guess the big question is, what was their shot going to be? And that turned out to be the American Revolution. So let me talk some about that and how they came to really strike up their partnership. As I mentioned, they were in different places. Washington being 25 years older. An interesting judge of that is John Adams. John Adams, who could criticize anyone with the best of them. I think he was our snarkiest founder. He once said of George Washington that he had the gift of silence. And that's something Adams didn't have. He said of Alexander Hamilton that he was a bastard brat of a Scottish peddler, a man who lived his life in a delirium of ambition. And I think the difference there is that generation that Washington had to grow up, to mellow, to become more mature. This is one imagining of their meeting in 1776. We actually don't know exactly when they met. They could have met in the summer of 1776 during the New York campaign. That was Washington's biggest defeat in the American Revolution. But Hamilton was a part of that battle. They might have met then. They might have met at the Battle of Trenton, which began at the end of 1776. That's the battle that follows the famous crossing, Washington's crossing of the Delaware. We're certain that they knew each other by early 1777 and the Battle of Princeton. In the play Hamilton, Hamilton becomes Washington's right-hand man at the Battle of New York. And Washington asks him to be his aide-de-camp, which is more or less his chief of staff. We're certain this didn't happen that early. It definitely happened after the Battle of Princeton, which produces a great story. This is a battle in the first week of 1777. It followed the Battle of Trenton, and Hamilton again was an artillery officer in this battle. Someone during this battle shot a cannon through Nassau Hall, the original building of what was then called the College of New Jersey, and decapitated a portrait of King George II. Now, whether it was Hamilton himself, I'm not sure, but he got credit for this, although we can't exactly trace it to him. But it's a fun story because Princeton had rejected Hamilton. When he came over from the Caribbean, he wanted to enter a college with the status of a junior. He wanted just to finish in a couple of years. Impulsive, he's always in a hurry. Princeton said no. So that's why he ended up at King's College in New York. It just so happened that his later rival, Aaron Burr, had gone to Princeton and had actually finished in 2 years. But it helps if your father was the president of the college. That was the case with Aaron Burr. So starting in early 1777, Hamilton becomes the aide-de-camp to Washington. This is an image of the aide-de-camp office at Valley Forge. And this was an incredibly important position. And part of it is just kind of rethinking what Washington himself did. He wasn't just a general of the Continental Army. He was really one of the pillars of the government. There's really only two institutions in the United States during the war. There's Congress and the Continental Army, aside from the different state governments. And those are the two national institutions. And so Washington's kind of like the mobile Pentagon, writing dozens and dozens and dozens of letters, and a lot of those letters are written by Hamilton. To give you a sense of how much paperwork there was, the papers of George Washington have been edited since the late 1960s. And they started different series. They started a presidential series, they started a retirement series, they started a war series. Most of the series are done except for the war. They're only up to the year 1780. You still have 3 years to go. There's just literally tens of thousands of pages that was produced. So it was a critical position that Hamilton had, particularly begging Congress for resources for the Continental Army. But he hated it. He wanted the battlefield glory. He wanted to fight. And he constantly asked Washington to basically be released from this position and to have a battlefield commission. And Washington repeatedly said no. To give you a sense of Hamilton's psychology at this time, he wrote to his friend John Lawrence, who's another star in the musical Hamilton, in September 1780. He wrote, "I hate Congress, I hate the army, I hate the world, I hate myself. The whole is a mass of fools and knaves." In the same letter, he seemed to hint at the possibility of suicide. As I mentioned, that had happened in his family. "I am disgusted with everything in this world. I have no other wish than as soon as possible to make a brilliant exit." And he would make an exit, not from the world, but from Washington's staff. Hamilton walked away in February 1781. This is one incident that's not treated very well in the musical, so I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about why Hamilton might have left Washington. Part of it was he was in love. He had met and married Elizabeth Schuyler in December of 1780. Schuyler was a real catch. She was the daughter of a general in the Continental Army, Philip Schuyler, who also happened to be quite wealthy, a wealthy New Yorker. One time, Hamilton had written to John Lawrence, and he described what he was looking for in a wife. And it basically boiled down to he wanted smart, beautiful, and rich. And with Eliza, it was check, check, check. He found all three. And he wrote incredibly affectionate letters to her. This is the very first that we have. He certainly wrote to her before this, but this is the first one that we have from July of 1781. This is after he had gone back to the army. He said, "I hope my beloved Betsy," which he called her, "will dismiss all apprehensions for my safety. Unhappily for public affairs, there seems to be little prospect of activity, and if there should be, Heaven will certainly be propitious to any attachment so tender, so genuine as ours. Heaven will restore me to the bosom of my love and permit me to enjoy with new relish the delights which are centered there. It costs me a great deal to be absent from them, but the privation is certainly only temporary. I impatiently long to hear from you the state of your mind since our painful separation. Be as happy as you can. I entreat you, my amiable, my beloved wife. But let not absence deprive me of the least particle of your affection. Always remember those tender proofs I have so frequently given you of mine, and preserve for me unabated the only blessing which can make life of any value to me. So the man could write a love letter. And there's a few other examples on the panels here that I recommend that you look at after the talk. So it was critical that he had somewhere to go when he left the Army in February of 1781. The actual way that it came about is not in the musical. In the musical, the song is called Meet Me Inside. And Washington gets angry at Hamilton for being the second in a duel that took place to defend Washington's honor. And then it's suggested that Eliza is expecting, and so he has to go home. It was true that Eliza was expecting, but Hamilton left on his own. And the reason why has to do with this building, which was Washington's headquarters at New Windsor, New York. That's right next to Newburgh, New York, which would become an important site later in the Revolution, about 50 miles north of New York. And Washington was headquartered there at the time, and he was at the top of the stairs inside this house, and he wanted to talk to Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was walking by him, and he said, "Wait just a minute, I have to go talk to someone." He was going somewhere, so I'll be right back. Well, while he was on this small errand, he ran into the Marquis de Lafayette, the Frenchman who could talk anybody's ear off, and so he seemed to take a little more time than he expected. He came back to the top of the stairs, and this is what Washington said to him. "You have kept me waiting at the head of the stairs these 10 minutes. I must tell you, sir, that you treat me with disrespect." Hamilton replied that he disagreed, but he said, "Since you have thought it necessary to tell me so, we part." And that was it. Washington thought that he had been waiting for 10 minutes. Hamilton thought he had been keeping him waiting for 2 minutes. That 8-minute difference meant a lot in the 18th century, in which honor, was so important. And so, there was a lot of things building. These were both ambitious men. Hamilton felt that Washington was keeping him down, and so he left the army. You see the difference in the maturity of the two men after this incident. Washington immediately sends someone to go to talk to Hamilton to try to bring him back. And then he continues to write to him in the weeks that follow. Hamilton never reaches out to Washington, and in fact he tells others rather disparaging things. He wrote to Philip Schuyler, his father-in-law, and he said, "For these past 3 years I have felt no friendship for him and have professed none." Sounds like someone with hurt feelings. Well, finally these two made up. Washington offered Hamilton the battlefield commission that he had always been looking for, and he ends up exercising that at the Battle of Yorktown, the culminating battle of the American Revolution. This is a great image of that. Hamilton is on the horse to the right, leading the charge. You see Washington in the center, and the other gentleman to the foreground. On the left-hand side of the painting is Lafayette, Henry Knox, and the French General Rochambeau are in the background. You notice this is painted by a gentleman named Rembrandt Peale. His father, Charles Peale, named all of his sons after great artists. No pressure. Rubens, Titian, Raphael, and Rembrandt. I'm surprised they didn't all have a complex. books. And a couple of them did become pretty good artists. So Hamilton and Washington, the whole group, end up getting to Yorktown. Incidentally, on this journey, that's the first time Washington visited Mount Vernon in the 8 years. I guess it wasn't 8 at that point, but it was the only time in the 8 years of the war that he ever visited home. And he had to because it was on the way. He had no other choice. But it just shows the sacrifice. More than 8 years, 3,000 days away from home. Really, really incredible. So at the Battle of Yorktown, Hamilton's assignment was to storm one of the redoubts, basically a hill that the British had, the high ground, that they had to take in order to defeat the British in this particular battle. And it was pretty grisly hand-to-hand combat. The Americans surprised the British. They didn't actually fire their muskets. They fought with bayonets. And there were pretty high casualties, especially on the British side. And so I guess the point is that Hamilton really did fight. He wasn't, in the Civil War they had the political generals, the guys that had the appointments that didn't really do much. But he actually did in the field. And this is the battle that forced the British into recognizing American independence. The most famous painting for the Battle of Yorktown is the surrender of Lord Cornwallis. Even though Lord Cornwallis is not in the painting, he's the main British general. He said he wasn't feeling well. For generations, historians have actually mocked him and said, yeah, he had hurt feelings too. But in fact, we now have pretty strong evidence that he probably had malaria. So he had hurt feelings, and he probably really was sick. He sent his second in command to offer the symbolic sword of surrender. And so George Washington sent his second in command, Benjamin Lincoln. That's the man in the foreground. You see Washington in the background. I sometimes ask my students, who are the people with the white flag? And I sometimes get the answer, well, those are the British. That's the flag of surrender. I said, no, that's the French. That was the French flag at the time, the Bourbon flag. On the other side where the Americans are, you can see Hamilton. Hamilton is standing next to the horse. And then next to Hamilton is John Lawrence, his partner on Washington's staff. And so in the book by Ron Chernow and in the musical, the song that is connected to Yorktown is The World Turned Upside Down. This was a British folk tune. It's possible that it could have been played at the end of the battle, but we don't have very good evidence of it. So it's one of those things that's kind of like we want it to be true because it's so perfect because the world really had been turned upside down with the Americans winning. But the source is from the 19th century. And I tell all my students, beware of anything from the 19th century. It's the century that lies. It's the century that makes up things about what happened during the Revolutionary era. But it had been an incredible event. Hamilton had definitely been a junior partner, I think, in the war. But you see him trying, I think especially in that moment in which he left Washington's staff, you see him trying to assert himself as something of an equal. And I think that would certainly happen during the presidency. So let me talk some about that and how these two men worked together to create the new American government. They were both nationalists, meaning they both wanted a stronger national government after the Revolution. Under the Articles of Confederation, the original government for the United States, the states were really like countries. I mean, it was much more like the European Union today than the United States. It was, all these, states were basically republics, independent republics. And so the Constitution, sought to address that. And I think because Hamilton and Washington had both been in the Continental Army, they had felt the weakness of the national government. And that's one reason why they wanted a stronger government. And so Hamilton famously gives a 6-hour speech in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, to the point where they all told him to sit down. Now in the musical, they don't go into detail about what he actually said. It would be a much longer musical if they did. But he actually wanted a government that looked much more like the British government. He wanted a president that served for life and the Senate for life. And I would say this is the one big thing that the musical gets wrong or doesn't share or kind of conceals, and that is how much of an elitist Hamilton became. He came from the most humble origins possible, but his ideas, once he actually got into the government, would be considered in favor of the more rich, powerful kind of the end of the spectrum. Now, I think the one thing you can say about the musical is you don't know what was inside him. You don't know what was inside his heart, right? And that's what art can do. Art can imagine that. Inside, he likely still was the young, scrappy and hungry kid from the Caribbean. But in any case, he was hoping for a very, powerful, strong national government. He had left when the Connecticut Compromise came together. It's also known as the Great Compromise. That's what creates the House of Representatives and the Senate. And this is what Washington wrote to Hamilton. When that compromise was coming together, Washington wrote, "In a word, I almost despair of seeing a favorable issue to the proceedings of the convention, and do therefore repent having had any agency in the business." It's an amazing statement. We celebrate the Connecticut Compromise today. That's what made the country. Washington almost walked away from the convention. I think that shows that it was a real compromise, that people gave up things. And he was particularly frustrated that all the states got equal vote in the Senate. He thought that that's what they were trying to get away from. And you wonder if Hamilton had been there, what his reaction would have been, because Washington swallowed hard and it came back the next day. Right? He didn't like it, but he said, okay. I don't know what, might have been another 6-hour speech from Hamilton. In any case, even though he wasn't, it wasn't the perfect outcome for him, Hamilton defended the new Constitution. He worked hard to have it ratified. He's one of the authors of the Federalist, which collected, we know today as the Federalist Papers. These are 85 essays written by Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Hamilton wrote 51 of them. Madison 29, and Jay 5. And I joke with my students that the Federalist Papers were written to torture students forevermore, advanced high school and college students. But they really are critical to understanding the Constitution. Washington becomes the president unanimously. He selects his first cabinet. For the Secretary of Treasury spot, Hamilton actually wasn't his first choice. Robert Morris, who had been the financier of the American Revolution, was his first choice. He turned Washington down, and then his life was just a downward spiral. He ended up in debtor's prison, died in obscurity, and that showed you shouldn't say no to George Washington. Hamilton had the good sense to say yes. And this is the original cabinet here. Henry Knox, the Secretary of Defense, Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, and Edmund Randolph, the Attorney General. I particularly like this image, which is from the 19th century, because you can't imagine these guys rapping, having a cabinet rap battle like a musical. Just hard to imagine. So Hamilton really took charge of the government. He even referred to it as his administration. And it helped, as the musical says, to have Washington on his side. Washington supported what he was doing, not out of, I think, personality, but because it was Washington's ideas as well. Washington liked the idea of a stronger central government, a strong financial system. And over the course of a year, I think Hamilton had one of the most exceptional creative years that anybody's ever had in American history. From January 1790 to December 1791, he released 3 long reports, one about public credit, debt, one about the National Bank, and one about manufacturing. And they're all genius. It's incredible that he did all of this in just a year. And they really went back, I think, to his roots in St. Croix, running that merchant firm because they all really promote a capitalistic, commercial economic system, what we would call capitalism. And so these are the four major points of it. Today, I think, with the benefit of hindsight, we'd say, well, of course, this is what you should do to have a strong financial system. At the time, it was incredibly controversial, each part of it. And the big reason was it looked a lot like the British again. The British had a national bank, the Bank of England. The British had a national debt. The British had taxes. Why did we fight the revolution if we were just going to recreate the British system? That's what a lot of people asked, including, as was mentioned in the introduction, people in this region, the whiskey rebels who were taxed under Hamilton's system, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But as I mentioned, this is early capitalism, and it was different than the world that Thomas Jefferson knew. Jefferson was born with land, and for him, having a large estate was the key to financial and political power. For Hamilton and others who weren't so lucky, there was no way to really replicate this. Hamilton was proposing a system where that could happen. Jefferson thought it was immoral. He thought it was immoral because it was so British. He also thought it was immoral because it introduced the idea of wages. Wages were thought to be very bad in the 18th century because it suggested that you were dependent on someone else for your livelihood. You weren't completely independent. And that was the benefit of land ownership in Jefferson's thinking. Well, we know that Hamilton really has won this debate over time. Our financial system, our economy looks like Hamilton's world much more than it does Jefferson's. Now I want to go into a little bit more of detail about the debate between these two, and I'm going to use a song from Hamilton, The Room Where It Happens. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing or rap. This will be a dramatic reading. And for those of you that know the song, you can kind of nod along. And for those of you that don't know it, I'll share the lyrics. The Room Where It Happens is a song about the Compromise of 1790. That's what produced the national debt in the United States. At the time, states had their own debts. Each state had their own debt. This might sound surprising, but it's actually illegal for states to have debts, to carry a debt. States have to balance, take some smoke and mirrors sometimes. But because of the Compromise of 1790, all the state debts were consolidated into one national debt. Well, Jefferson was opposed to this. He was someone who favored state power, state rights, and so he disagreed with this, but he made a compromise that helped to make it happen. So we want to judge Lin-Manuel Miranda as a historian here. We'll give him a grade at the end of this. See how he does in this class. In the song, Aaron Burr is the narrator, like he is for much of the musical. And Burr longs to be in the room where it happens. And that's where business is done, where decisions get made. And the it in this case is this compromise, which would produce the national debt for Hamilton. And it would move the seat of government, what we call the capital, to the Potomac, what becomes Washington, D.C. That's the basic trade that is made. And so this is what we hear in the song. Two Virginians, Jefferson and Madison, and an immigrant walk into a room, diametrically opposed foes. They emerge with a compromise, having opened up doors that were previously closed. The immigrant emerges with unprecedented financial power, a system he can shape however he wants. The Virginians emerge with the nation's capital. That's very frustrating for historians. We have to write about 400 words to basically equal all that Miranda says there in a couple of lines. But that gives you a little overview. The action begins with Jefferson and Madison talking about what they're going to do. And Madison says, maybe we can solve one problem with another and win a victory for the Southerners. In other words, Jefferson, oh ho, Madison, a quid pro quo. Jefferson says, I supposed. Madison asks, wouldn't you like to work a little closer to home? And Jefferson says, actually I would. I think he's already thinking about the traffic in Washington in the Belt. I barely made it here. Madison says, well, I propose the Potomac. And Jefferson says, and you'll provide him with the votes? Madison, well, we'll see how it goes. And they enter into the negotiation. As audience members, you don't actually see what happens because it's the room where it happened. And the chorus says, the room where it happened, where no one really knows how the game is played, the art of the trade, how the sausage gets made. We just assume that it happens, but no one else is in the room where it happens. So whatever happens, happens, and then we get a recap. Burr and Hamilton talk about what had taken place. And Burr knows the basic deal, the trading of the seat of government for the debt. Burr asks, what did they say to you to get you to sell New York City down the river? New York City had been the capital at the time. Hamilton doesn't respond. So Burr asks another question. Did Washington know about the dinner? Was there presidential pressure to deliver? Still no response. And then the tone changes. Burr kind of catches on. This went well for Hamilton. He says, or did you know even then, it doesn't matter where you put the US Capitol? Hamilton agrees and says, because we'll have the banks. We're in the same spot. Burr recognizes, you got more than you gave. And Hamilton says, and I wanted what I got. And so this is the room where it happens. Like most of the musical Hamilton, it's characterized as a triumph for Hamilton. And so that's what I want to put to the test and look at some of the actual history. The actual history starts here. This was George Washington's second executive mansion in New York City. And one day in June 1790, Jefferson encountered Hamilton outside of this house, seeming very depressed. And he was so depressed because he didn't have the votes in Congress for the national debt. And our main source for this is Jefferson, and I'll give you some of his words. Listen closely, because he wrote this a couple years later when he really didn't like Alexander Hamilton. He says, Jefferson said, going to the president's one day, I met Hamilton as I approached the door. His look was somber, haggard, and dejected beyond description. Even his dress uncouth and neglected. He asked to speak with me. We stood in the street near the door. He opened the subject of the assumption of the state debts, the necessity of it in the general fiscal arrangements, and its indispensable necessity towards the preservation of the Union. On considering the situation of things, I thought the first step towards some conciliation of views would to bring Mr. Madison and Colonel Hamilton to a friendly discussion on the subject. I immediately wrote to each one to come and dine with me the next day, mentioning that we should be alone in the room where it happens. He didn't actually say that last time. So the actual room where it happens, well, first of all, this is Washington's residence today, 39 Broadway. Like so many buildings in New York, it's a mixed-use office building. But it does have a plaque recognizing its history. This is where Jefferson lived, 57 Maiden Lane, another mixed-use office building with a plaque. So the original building doesn't exist. So again, we have to imagine what happened inside. These are the three that were there. And you know, it's sometimes said in journalism that you shouldn't write a story without at least two sources, right? You need more than one source. I often tell my students the same thing with history. We can't just depend on Jefferson's account. So there are other accounts of the time that this dinner actually took place, that this trade took place. The New Yorkers were upset. People in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia were a little more optimistic because as part of the deal, the seat of government was going to be in Philadelphia for 10 years, basically the 1790s, while they built a magical new city on the Potomac, which at the time they called the Federal City. People in Pennsylvania thought it would never actually happen. They They would never, people in Washington don't like the city referred to as a swamp. Because I guess it's a scientific definition of a swamp. It doesn't quite fit. It's swampy, right? It's a swampy place. One Pennsylvania congressman said it was just as likely that the seat of government would be established at Mississippi, Detroit, or Winnipesaukee Pond, which is a fictional place. He's saying, this isn't gonna happen. So, in terms of Hamilton coming out on top, I think the evidence supports Miranda's interpretation. And the best source for that is Jefferson himself. About a year later, Jefferson wrote to Washington talking about how this was the biggest mistake he'd ever made doing this deal with Hamilton. These are his words. He said he had been duped by the Secretary of the Treasury and made a fool for forwarding his schemes, not then sufficiently understood by me. And of all the errors of my political life, this has occasioned me the deepest regret. Hamilton had used the deal, in Jefferson's words, to change the political complexion of the government of the United States. And so after he got the debt, he had the momentum to then get the National Bank. He passed the various taxes. He actually didn't pass his bill on manufacturing, but all the other pieces were in place to start a manufacturing economy in the United States. So we'll give him an A. That's what my students do when they get an A. They look like that. Another person who was happy about this deal was George Washington, because he wanted the seat of government on the Potomac. This is one of Washington's favorite family portraits. He liked it so much he ordered 4 copies for Mount Vernon. It shows him with his step-grandchildren, George Washington Parke Custis. That'd be the gentleman that built Arlington House, which became Arlington Cemetery. His daughter, Mary, would go on to wed Robert E. Lee. And that was the union of the Custis, Washington, Lee families. The woman, Nellie Custis, the step-granddaughter, and an enslaved valet, probably a person named Christopher Shields. And of course, Martha Washington, who had an incredible parlor trick. She would take her fan and she could point to the National Mall without looking. Unbelievable. Washington spent a lot of time on this. He was excited about this part of this deal. Now, the people that weren't very excited about Hamilton's economic program were the people in Pennsylvania, the Whiskey Rebels. Alexander Hamilton actually coined the term the Whiskey Rebellion. It was his policy, after all, that the farmers in this region were opposing. And they opposed it from the very beginning. Starting in 1791, things got out of control by 1794. Tax collectors got tarred and feathered. Houses were burned. And Hamilton and Washington decided there had to be some response from the national government. Washington actually wrote to the Supreme Court and asked whether it was legal for him to raise an army to come and put down this disturbance. He got a yes, and so they put together an army, a militia of 13,000 men, which is a huge army for the day, from 4 different states, to really show, I think, a sign of strength, that you're going to have to follow these laws even if you don't like them. Washington was the first and last president to lead troops in uniform in the field. Both Madison and Abraham Lincoln were in the field with troops, but Washington was actually all suited up. He led them as far as Bedford, Pennsylvania. At that point, Hamilton took over and brought them all the way to the Pittsburgh area. They made around 150 arrests. Washington ended up giving clemency to all of the Whiskey Rebels and pardoned the actual leaders. But it was a real moment, I think, in the founding era. It was a real standoff. And it shows the feelings at the time that Hamilton couldn't leave town in November of 1794, except with 6 armed soldiers trying to get out of Pittsburgh. So it's good that you're all showing them this love now, So soon after the Whiskey Rebellion, Hamilton stepped down as Secretary of the Treasury. We hear this so much today that people want to spend more time with their families. I think that might have actually been true in this case. I think Hamilton was tired. I think he had accomplished what he wanted to. During the Whiskey Rebellion, Eliza had had a miscarriage, and he'd had enough. Jefferson had left a couple of years before. He had stepped down in 1793. And so Washington wrote Alexander Hamilton a very affectionate letter when he left the office of the Treasury Secretary. And I think you really see that these two really, I think, admired one another by this point. And of course, they worked together on Washington's farewell address. Washington stayed in touch with Hamilton, turned to him. This is the song "One Last Time" in the musical. And there's a long debate among historians about who wrote the farewell address, whether it was Washington or whether it was Hamilton. And as I tell my students, often the best answer to those types of questions is yes. They both wrote it, and they traded it back and forth. And if you go back and read it today, it's quite moving, especially in light of our own polarization today. It's really about union. It's really about the Americans coming together. So it's obviously a masterful piece. I'm going to close here with a little bit of the post-history, some of the things that you don't always learn about with these two men. Things that didn't make the musical. Maybe if there's a second, there's a sequel, they will. They'll have all of us right. Hamilton was a young man. By the time he walked away from the government, he was just about 40 years old. Washington, quite older, 65. At the end of his presidency, he would die when he was 67. And that was one of the really smart things about the farewell address, is that if Washington hadn't stepped down and had died when he died in December of 1799, it would have been in the middle of his third term. I mean, there really would have been a sense that presidency was for life, like Hamilton first thought. Well, Hamilton always did better, I think, when he was with Washington. I think he was a stabilizing force. His life spun a little bit out of control when Washington wasn't around. And one thing that happened when he left his side is that he had this public scandal over an affair he had when he was the Treasury Secretary. He had an affair with a woman named Maria Reynolds. It seems that her husband, James, was in on a con against Hamilton to blackmail him of money. Members of Congress talked to Hamilton. They found out about it. They investigated. We call this an investigation today. They investigated. They found out that he had not misused any public money. That it was a private affair. And so they actually let it go. But a writer at the time, a journalist, a guy named James Callender, broke the story in 1797. This would be the same gentleman that would break the story about Thomas Jefferson having relations with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. People didn't believe that story, but they believed the Hamilton story. And one reason they believed it is because Hamilton defended himself. He wrote a 59-page pamphlet with way too much information and detail, outlining that yes, he had had this affair, but he had not betrayed the public trust. And it shows the values of the time. He admitted to a lot, and he really, I think, hurt his family. We would say today, he kind of threw Eliza under the bus, I think. And so it's a very low moment for him. Well, at this moment, Washington reached out to him. You're probably wondering why this thing is up here. There's a wine cooler, 18th century style. It means it kept wine cool. Washington ordered 4 of these when he was president in Philadelphia. And he sent one to Hamilton during this scandal. And I'm just going to read you the short letter that he wrote to him. Washington wrote, "My dear sir, not for any intrinsic value the thing possesses, but as a token of my sincere regard and friendship for you, and as a remembrancer of me, I pray you to accept a wine cooler for 4 bottles, which Colonel Biddle is directed to forward from Philadelphia, where with other articles it was left, together with this letter to your address. It is one of 4 which I imported in the early part of my late administration of government, 2 of which were ever used. I pray you to present my best wishes, in which Mrs. Washington joins me, to Mrs. Hamilton and the family, and that you would be persuaded that with every sentiment of the highest regard, I remain your sincere friend and affectionate, humble servant, George Washington. That's very classy, right? He doesn't mention the affair, he doesn't go into any detail. He didn't have to. This is what Hamilton's response was. He wrote back, "The token of your regard which it announces is very precious to me and will always be remembered." And this became a treasured heirloom in the Hamilton family. It was passed down in generations. At some point, Washington's letter was inscribed actually on the wine cooler. And finally, in 2012, the daughter of Hamilton's great-great-great-grandson put it up for auction. And at Christie's, it went for $800,000. Now this is 3 years before the musical debuted. I bet they could have got double if they would have just waited a little while. Washington and Hamilton had one other significant interaction before Washington's death. There's a war that most people don't know about because it wasn't an official war. It's called the Quasi-War that the United States fought with France in the late 1790s. This is during the French Revolution, when both France and Britain, they're at war with each other, and they're both interfering with American shipping. Eventually, the United States will go to war with Britain, too, in the War of 1812. Well, in the 1790s, in this naval war, Alexander Hamilton convinced the president, John Adams, and the Federalist Congress to create an army. And everyone agreed that if there's going to be an army in the United States, there's only one person that can be in charge of it, and that's George Washington. Washington is 65, 66 at this point, and he said, okay, well, I'll be in charge of your army, but I will only go on the field if the French actually show up. And Washington said his other condition is that Hamilton would be the second in command and would really be the person that would be running this army. Well, many historians have looked at this and come to the conclusion that Hamilton created this army not to fight the French, but to fight the Jeffersonians. He was getting this army prepared in the case of a civil war. That's how heated this rivalry had become. And one person that believed that was John Adams. John Adams got suspicious of this army and actually set in motion the diplomacy that ended this war. He ended the only time he was popular in his life. John Adams got a lot of popularity during this war, but he ended it. For that reason, he's one of the political figures that is featured in John F. Kennedy's Profiles in Courage, which each chapter is about a politician that went against their own self-interest. Well, this really upset Hamilton, and he didn't support Adams in his re-election, and hence Jefferson won in 1800. So this is a recruiting poster for the Quasi-War. It's been reused at different times, and people mistake it as a recruiting poster for the American Revolution as 1776, but it's not. It's actually from the 1790s. This is a World War I poster. Well, Washington died December 1799, and Hamilton, you can see in his reaction to many people, was filled with grief. He wrote a famous letter to Tobias Lear, that was Washington's personal secretary, and Hamilton said that I've been much indebted to the kindness of the general, and he was an aegis, very essential to me. That word, aegis, that's a classical term, it means shield. And people have interpreted that to mean that he kind of used Washington to get certain things done. But I think that's the wrong interpretation. I think he's saying that Washington was his shield, his protector, which he certainly had been. Well, with Washington gone, things got even worse for Hamilton. I don't want to give anything away, but there's an incident that happened in 1804. That's what's, you have the whole story right here on these panels. Hamilton developed this rivalry with Aaron Burr. They're both New Yorkers. in the election of 1800, Aaron Burr was Thomas Jefferson's running mate. They both got the exact same number of electoral votes, 73 votes each. And because at the time, the Constitution didn't distinguish between electoral votes for the president and the vice president. And so what Burr should have done in this instance was step aside, because Jefferson was obviously the head of the ticket. But Burr kind of liked the idea that he had just been elected president, at least tied. And so, according to the Constitution, if there's a dispute, if there's not a clear winner, it goes to the House. Well, this was a Federalist Congress that didn't want to vote for either of these men. Hamilton is still the most powerful figure in the Federalist Party, even though he wasn't in Congress. And he had to decide, between his rival, Jefferson, and his other rival, Burr. And this is one of the big dramas in the musical. He ends up siding with Jefferson. And the reason why is because Jefferson at least had convictions. Hamilton didn't agree with him, but he had convictions. Burr, his only conviction was himself, to promote himself. And in fact, that's true. If you look at all the different founders, what they comment about Burr, they all say that he is someone who was self-interested. And that's a very derogatory term in this period, that someone was self-interested. Well, Burr was actually dropped from Jefferson's ticket in 1804. By the way, the 12th Amendment fixed that problem with the vice president and the president. Jefferson didn't like Burr after this incident. So Burr ran for governor of New York. Hamilton criticized him. It got into the press. Hamilton said he was despicable. Burr challenged him to a duel. They went to New Jersey, where, as they say in the musical, everything is legal. And there was a protocol for duels at the time. You were supposed to be strong enough to go, put yourself in that position, but then you were really supposed to miss. You weren't supposed to aim. Hamilton missed. He shot into the air. Burr aimed, hit Hamilton. On the exact same field, Hamilton's son, Philip, had died in a duel 3 years earlier, defending his father's honor with the same pistols. They were Hamilton family pistols, which happen to be on display right now in Washington, D.C. They're really rare, aren't seen very, very much. This is Hamilton's grave in New York City. I'll read you one last letter. This is a letter that Hamilton wrote to Eliza that she was only supposed to read if he didn't survive the duel. It's dated July 4th, 1804. This letter, my very dear Eliza, will not be delivered to you unless I shall first have terminated my earthly career. To begin, as I humbly hope from a redeeming grace and divine mercy, a happy immortality. If it had been possible for me to have avoided the interview, meaning the duel, my love for you and my precious children would have been alone a decisive motive. But it was not possible without sacrifices which have rendered me unworthy of your esteem. I need not tell you of the pangs I feel from the idea of quitting you and exposing you to the anguish which I know you would feel. Nor could I dwell on the topic, lest it should unman me. The consolations of religion, my beloved, can alone support you, and these you have a right to enjoy. Fly to the bosom of your God and be comforted. With my last idea, I shall cherish the sweet hope of meeting you in a better world. Adieu, best of wives and best of women. Embrace all my darling children for me. Ever yours, A.H. If you know the musical, there's a song, The Best of Wives, Best of Women. And so that title is taken from this letter. Now, Eliza would live for another 50 years. Never remarry. She lived until the age of 97, died in 1854, and she did all kinds of amazing work for orphans, for women, in the anti-slavery movement. And she also essentially became the caretaker and first editor of Alexander Hamilton's papers. She collected them and got them published. And so in the musical, she's the one that preserves its memory, as she did in actual life. A lot of people don't know she also helped preserve the memory of George Washington. Eliza spent the last 6 years of her life in Washington, D.C. She lived on 8th Street, right near the White House. One of her daughters, who actually was widowed as well, lived in Washington, so she went and lived with her. And along with Dolly Madison, James Madison's wife, who was still alive, they helped to raise money to start the Washington Monument, which broke ground in 1848. It stopped in 1854, the year that Eliza died, because they didn't have enough money. And then a small thing called the Civil War happened. This is what it would have looked like. This is how Eliza would have known the Washington Monument, what it looked like when she died. Of course, it eventually got finished. Took a long time, into the 1880s. And so Washington has his monuments. I think now with this musical, Hamilton has his monument. And really, they both have this country. I think America is their greatest monument. Thank you very much.